Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So the looming threat of tariffs from the U.S. has premiers here rolling up their sleeves. Alberta's Danielle Smith went alone to meet with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Ontario's Doug Ford now pushing for what he's calling Fortress AMCAN. David Eby is calling for export bans on BC minerals as potential retaliation. What do you think is the trump card in dealing with this tariff threat? That's up first. And Welcome to Canada is CBC's new series on immigration. What's your experience as a new immigrant? Call us after 12:30. I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. In 6 days, Donald Trump will be inaugurated into office as U.S. president again for his second term. Now, Trump has threatened to impose blanket 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports on day one. Well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau traveled to Mar-a-Lago, Trump's Florida residence and golf course, for a meeting last November. And in the recent days, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith headed down for a meeting that she called friendly and constructive. Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, he's been speaking to U.S. media, warning about cutting off Ontario's electricity from U.S. states. And this week, British Columbia Premier David Eby expressed concerns and said he's pushing for another retaliatory measure if needed.
The discussion has been about tariffs or charges that are going to be put on what seems to be primarily consumer goods coming into Canada. And I think that's important. But I'm also encouraging the federal government to look at export bans in relation to critical minerals, for example, that we produce here in Canada, the United States can't get in other places. Obviously, BC produces a lot of energy for the United States, electricity as well as natural gas. These are significant economic drivers for the United States. China has restricted one of the critical minerals that we produce here in British Columbia, refusing to send it to the U.S. The only place they get it from is a smelter in Trail, British Columbia. And if you don't get it from us, then you don't get it at all. These are the kinds of conversations, unfortunately, we're going to have with the Americans if they're going to do this to our families.
We're asking you, what is the best approach to dealing with incoming U.S. President Donald Trump's threats of tariffs? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone or email bctoday@cbc.ca. Joining me now is Jeff Meyers. He's an instructor in criminology at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. He's a PhD in constitutional law and theory from the London School of Economics. Jeffrey, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and your listeners.
Well, what are you looking at as you watch the days leading up to Inauguration Day on Monday?
Well, my area of expertise and research is on the question of the rule of law, and in particular, the relationship between the rule of law and democracy. So one of the things that I've been watching in the days leading up to the inauguration has been the conduct of Mr. Trump itself. And that conduct has been that he's been effectively trying to conduct foreign policy, meeting with foreign leaders, and otherwise acting as though he's president prior to being sworn into office. And that actually is a violation of something called the Logan Act, which requires that there be only one president at a time, only one U.S. foreign policy at a time. So the degree to which Mr. Trump has sort of been out in front and behaving as though he were already president is just a preview of, I think, the fact that his second term will be characterized by an even greater disregard for the rule of law than was his first. And the disregard for the rule of law in his first was obviously considerable, as you know.
What do you make then of the Prime Minister here in Canada traveling to participate in this kind of negotiation, in these meetings, and now Alberta Premier Danielle Smith? They have willingly gone down to meet with him and have these kinds of meetings ahead of him actually becoming inaugurated.
Look, I'm not suggesting that it's somehow abnormal or untoward to meet with the president in the period, a president-elect prior to their being sworn in. But there's certain types of conduct, certain types of meetings, certain types of back channels, and sort of contradictory foreign policy, which is sort of put in place, which do step over that line, in my opinion. Meeting, however, with the prime minister or with premiers, to myself, is not necessarily in and of itself objectionable. I suppose it depends on the purpose of the meeting and what what happens at the meeting. I've observed and watched the meetings. I think that the meeting with Justin Trudeau and Romeo LeBlanc and their team, minus Chrystia
Dominic
Freeland,
LeBlanc.
Dominic Blanc, sorry, minus Chrystia Freeland was obviously a disaster in many ways, and obviously, we've seen premiers responding in different ways, sending out different types of messaging.
Right.
Premier Smith in Alberta visiting, they're sending out a different kind of message. I mean, I think it looks like, as if you're currying favor or kissing the ring, and I don't necessarily think that's in Canada's best interest. So yeah, it lays bare and obvious for everyone to see the degree to which Canada is vulnerable as a result of the threats that Donald Trump is making about these tariffs. And that, we're a weaker country than the United States, and are in many ways we are more reliant and more vulnerable to the United States than it is reliant and vulnerable to us and our economy. So that reality is laid bare, and the panic and concern is obvious.
Yeah, I mean, you see people, different premiers, really trying to round up whatever resources they have, right? And so you say, yes, we rely on the United States more. The message seems to be coming from someone like David Eby that you also rely on us, that the United States also relies on a place like BC. Now he's suggesting that he's calling on the federal government to look at export bans when it comes to critical minerals. How effective do you think that might be, that idea of the retaliation?
Well, I definitely think, I mean, I'm not an expert on trade law, but I will tell you that the fact is that in my opinion, just as a matter of strategy in terms of entering into these kind of geopolitical negotiations, which in a country like Canada, which is a federation in which the provinces have significant and co-equal powers with the provinces, right? Each province is sovereign within its jurisdiction under Section 92 of the Constitution. And effectively, there are areas of overlap with the federal government and coordination required. However, the provinces have a real interest in this. And the provinces are now speaking through their premiers to some extent in the absence of federal leadership, in the obvious situation where we have a prime minister who's recently resigned, a leadership race in a coming election. So you have a variety of premiers, each taking slightly different tacks. I will say this, I think that what Premier Eby is doing and saying, in the tone he's taking, is probably what is most effective. I've never been a big fan of Premier Ford, and I've written things and been critical of his conduct in the past. But however, I do think actually the way he's entered into US media, in particular some of the right-wing media that's sort of online and MAGA adjacent, to speak directly to Trump in a way that's firm, I think actually may be more successful than the kind of tack that Prime Minister Trudeau took when he, went down to Mar-a-Lago and sort of appeared to get beat up and mocked. It seemed that firmer tact is right. There are levers, right? The United States has significant reliance on Canada, particularly for, in fact, our crude oil. Which is something we provide, what's called sweet crude to the Americans. It's not easy for them to produce enough themselves or get that from elsewhere. So that's a point of leverage, as are these rare earths, right? Because to the extent that they otherwise located in countries which aren't close allies or which have more extended geographic distances, there is an interest there. And again, just as last time when Trump was president, the Trudeau government, sort of had a Team Canada approach to convincing governors in states with really large trading partnerships with Canada or that were on the border, for example, to see that for them the impacts would be enormous. So they're right to lean into these vulnerability points and to be firm. I think that's better than sort of just looking panicked or offering to solve problems which Donald Trump has suggested, are serious or major problems without providing any evidence.
You're talking about the border.
That's some madness. Yeah, I think some of the response in Alberta around, sort of the contrast between, for example, Premier Smith's response to claims about a porous border and fentanyl pouring in, and policing the border to the response of Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, couldn't have been sharper. I mean, president of Mexico said it's up to you to demonstrate these problems, and it's also up to you to police your own border. It's never been under international law up to another country to police their neighbor's border. They police their own border. And in Canada, there's no way to argue that there may be fentanyl that comes in here, but there's fentanyl that comes in from Mexico. There's fentanyl that comes in from China. And also, the suggestion that our border is a dangerous and porous source of migrants and drugs is insane. And America and Canada could easily raise the fact that the American border is a dangerous and porous border for guns and firearms.
Let me
come
just,
into this country. Yeah.
Really good to have you with us. I'm just going to go back to our topic for today, because I understand there are many angles to it as well. But our topic today, asking our audience as well, what is the best approach to dealing with the threat of blanket 25% tariffs from incoming President Donald Trump of the United States. And he will be inaugurated on January 20th. He has said he will bring these in as soon as possible. And I'm happy to welcome our guest, Jeff Meyers, an instructor in criminology at Kwantlen Polytechnic University with a PhD in constitutional law and theory from the London School of Economics. Let's take your calls now. You can join us, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Henry is on the line from Port Moody. Hi, Henry.
Hi, Michelle and Jeff. I'm just wondering why no one has brought up that most of the Canadian businesses are American-owned, like 80%. If you think about how many are actually Canadian, they're mostly all American. So he puts those tariffs on us. Well, isn't that like shooting himself in the foot, like hurting all its American businesses?
Henry, thank you very much. What have we heard from economists, Jeff? And you're not an economist. I'll just ask you from your perspective. I know that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have said that threats of tariffs would hurt American workers as well. They say significant harms to U.S. manufacturers, farmers, and ranchers. So. What is the message being sent from businesses in the United States?
Well, I think for starters, in terms of the degree to which Canadian businesses are U.S. owned, I'm not sure I don't know the source of that information or whether that's an accurate statement.
Sure.
What I do understand from economists is that the supply lines are so integrated, particularly in Southern Ontario, with both at Windsor with Michigan, but also with New York in terms of the manufacture of automobiles. And that was something that Donald Trump was isolating on. And one of the reasons for that is because one of the primary claims has been it's going to be impossible to disentangle our production because, for example, an automobile component, and this is what industry is saying and the unions are saying and the companies as well are saying, is many components go back and forth over the border multiple times. So it's very difficult to say whether they're made in Canada or the United States, for example. So that's going to be a considerable difficulty. But I think what President Trump was alluding to is that, in his view, at least 20% of the automobiles in the United States have those Canadian components, and that the United States can withstand even if there was some kind of work stoppage there, right? So it's going to be this kind of, that's what hardball negotiations look like. But will it impact the American economy? Well, American economists all say that Mr. Trump doesn't understand economics, even basic economics, or how tariffs work, or what the meaning of a trade deficit is. He just views the trade deficit as something which makes America a loser and therefore presses on it politically. So no, it probably won't be great for American consumers or American businesses either, but that free trade Chamber of Commerce constituency is out of power within the Republican Party. It's been taken over by the MAGA interests, the old free trading Reagan Bush types, and the commentators that go with that and the chattering classes are now on the outs, and they're not represented like they were last time around the cabinet table or among Trump's key economic advisors. So he's going to be acting more like Theodore Roosevelt than Ronald Reagan.
Let's take another call. Thank you so much for the call, Henry. And just another email here. Let's read some emails from you. Robert writes, provincial premiers seem to be trying to cut their own deal with Trump, in particular Premier Smith from Alberta, trying to carve out an exemption for oil and gas to be free of tariffs. They need to stop this practice. They need to sit down with the federal government and present a united front to bargain with Trump. United we stand, divided we fall. And there's been an announcement from the federal government that there will be some kind of a meeting ahead of the inauguration date. Marilyn writes, what I believe needs to happen is the provinces of Canada must band together and stand strong. Trump loves to create confusion and chaos. He is an expert at it. I'm embarrassed that each province is scrambling to make their own best deals and therefore working against one another. Ray writes, maybe it's time to start negotiating a free trade agreement with China. And Scott writes, the U.S. is proposing tariffs and Canada needs leverage. Here's a simple idea. Announce 100% tariffs on electricity, oil, and gas exports to the U.S. as a countermeasure. Okay, thank you for those suggestions. Our email is bctoday@cbc.ca. Peter is on the line now from Chilliwack. What do you think is the best way to deal with these tariff threats, Peter?
We're caught in an American poverty trap.
What do you mean?
They transferred control of all our resources to foreign churches on the other side of the border and left us in poverty. We're not going to be able to deal with this problem we got unless we have reconciliation. We need access to our local resources. We don't want Chinese banks.
Okay. And so reconciliation, you're saying more pursuing of resource development here in Canada?
Well, we're stuck in 18th century holding pens, drinking fracked water, no access to our resources, and a foreign Caucasian coalition controlling our resources from the other side of the border. We're not benefiting. We're living in poverty because we're being plundered by the U.S. government. And tell me one country in the world that the U.S. has helped when they went to war. Which country has the U.S. helped?
Peter, thank you so much for your call. So more of a call there for self-reliance. Stuart is next now in Victoria. Hi, Stuart.
Hi, Michelle.
Thanks very much for calling in. What do you think is the trump card in dealing with Trump?
Well, thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to let you know that I was the BC trade representative during the Canada-U.S. free trade negotiations in the late 80s. And I think we need to realize that in trade policy, retaliation actually is a fairly common occurrence. We actually did this in 2016. We retaliated against all sorts of American items when they threatened, when the first Trump administration put a 10% tariff on steel and aluminum. I'm concerned, and I'm saying this as somebody who worked in the provincial government, about an absolute vacuum of leadership at the federal level on this, allowing our premiers to go off sort of madly in all directions, speaking for their specific interests. I think we have to be very careful about targeting retaliation vis-a-vis the Americans, because one thing I can say for sure, Michelle, is that trade with the United States is a lot more important to Canada than American trade with Canada is to the Americans. Trade with the United States accounts for about a quarter of our GDP, our exports. And I am often saying that NAFTA, or the new NAFTA, or whatever you want to call it, is actually the most important economic document we have in Canada, bar none. That's not the case on the other side of the border. Trade only accounts for about 20% of American GDP, and their trade is much more diversified. I think, listeners will be probably interested to know that Canada is no longer the number one trading partner of the United States. We've been taken over by Mexico, and China is close behind, and the Americans have got a more diversified pattern, whereas in our case, we have managed to concentrate our trade on the United States, and we find ourselves in a very vulnerable position.
So what do you think is, first of all, how much of a threat is there right now to the new NAFTA, to the USMCA, and what is the way forward if not retaliatory tariffs?
Well, there's two threats to the new NAFTA. One happens on Monday, when President Trump gets inaugurated, and I've got to believe the 25% tariffs coming on. But on Canada Day, Michelle, this year, the whole agreement is up for review. And the Americans could at that time just walk and say, we've had it with this agreement. And that will take away this fundamental role that we've got. On retaliation, I hear people like Premier Ford saying we'll cut off hydro to the United States. I looked this up. The eastern grid of the United States is dependent on imports from Ontario Hydro for less than 1% of their energy needs, whereas Ontario imports 70% of their natural gas from the United States. So it's going to open up a real risk to do that.
Yeah. What would you say should be done then?
I reflect on the last time, and here, I need to speak to the fact that provinces do have a role to play here. We did a very targeted retaliation, Michelle. One of my favorites was the LDB and a number of Canadian liquor boards went after Kentucky bourbon. Why? Because that was the home constituency of Mitch McConnell, the U.S. House Senate leader from Kentucky. So going at those points. Michigan, the auto trade, your guest has already talked about that. We saw actually a couple of years ago what happened when our border got blockaded between Canada and the United States, between Windsor and Detroit.
Right.
That bridge takes $13 million an hour of commerce over it, and the American auto plants had to shut down for 2 days until the supply chains reopened. So
be specific in what you're targeting.
We pick.
Stuart, I have to jump in just for in the interest of time, but thank you so much for painting that picture. And it's great to hear from you, given your perspective as someone who worked on NAFTA in the 80s. Really good to hear from you. And I do have to wrap it up there. But just this morning, Donald Trump posted a comment that he's creating an external revenue service to collect tariffs and duties from foreign sources. And Jeffrey, I want to thank you very much for your time. We will watch to see what happens on Monday if those tariffs do come to fruition, and see how Canada deals with it and how premiers deal with it. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Michelle.
That's Jeff Meyers, instructor at Kwantlen Polytechnic University with a PhD in constitutional law and theory from the London School of Economics. It is 12:28 now, and you're with BC Today. Well, an update to a story we brought you yesterday. Former BC Premier Christy Clark has announced today she will not run for the Liberal leadership. And in a statement, she says there isn't enough time to mount a successful campaign and that her French is not where it needs to be. Her potential run did hit a snag on the weekend after stating in a CBC interview that she had never joined the Conservative Party, despite evidence showing she had briefly joined to vote in their leadership race. Also today, François-Philippe Champagne said he is not running as well. Meanwhile, former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart last night. He's expected to announce his campaign this Thursday. Chrystia Freeland, Karina Gold, and Jonathan Wilkinson still said some of the others who are said to be considering a run for the Liberal leadership. We asked you yesterday who would be a top contender and what would be the top issues in the Liberal leadership race. Randy writes from Burnaby, it's Carney's race to lose. He's the best option. Carolyn writes, Christy Clark seemed to be counting on regional support in BC. Many of us who lived through her era up to her defeat in 2017 do not forget her regressive policies affecting the environment, schools, healthcare, labor, and support for people with housing needs and problem substance use. Her common mantra was get a job, an ill-informed misunderstanding of poverty and social inequities. Thank you so much for all your emails. bctoday@cbc.ca. You're with BC Today, live here on CBC Radio 1, on CBC Television, and you can watch online too on our website, cbc.ca/BC. You can use the CBC News app or catch us on YouTube at the CBC British Columbia page. It's 12:30 now, and coming up, we are going to talk about the experiences of new immigrants coming to Canada, and that's in light of a new series that the CBC has put together called Welcome to Canada. We'll give you some of that and the findings that they received from a survey and what what stories they've gotten and heard from new immigrants. We'd love to hear from you as well. If you're a new immigrant, what has been your experience being new to this country? We'll take your calls coming up after the CBC News Update with Rob Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. A Vancouver Island RCMP officer is on paid leave after being charged with sexual assault and uttering threats last April. Jason Simon has been charged with 2 counts of sexual assault, both in Nanaimo, and 1 count of uttering threats in Victoria. He's scheduled to appear in court in Nanaimo January 30th. The Office of the BC Ombudsperson says it's investigating complaints that some public schools are excluding students who are disruptive or who have disabilities. Ombudsperson Jay Chalk says his office will examine the complaints that those children have received little to no instruction. Some complaints allege school districts are excluding students due to unsafe behavior. Others point to inadequate resources. And as we've been hearing on the show, former Premier Christy Clark says she will not run for the leadership of the federal Liberal Party. After establishing a team to explore a leadership bid, Clark had been expected to launch a campaign. However, she says the shortened schedule to determine a replacement for Justin Trudeau doesn't allow her enough time to run a competitive race. And now the forecast on the north coast, mainly cloudy this afternoon with a high of 9. Highs around 6 with some sunshine and strong winds in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 5. Highs around -1 with sunny breaks in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 0. And mainly cloudy this afternoon in Greater Victoria. Some sunshine in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley, with highs around 5. That's your CBC News Update from Vancouver.
Rob, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Rob Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. It is a busy news day, and let's bring you up to date on the LA wildfires as well. It's another dangerous day in Southern California. A change in the weather brings no respite as winds continue to pick up across LA. They're creating conditions for new flames as crews battle existing wildfires. The U.S. National Weather Service is predicting winds that could hit speeds of up to 120 kilometers per hour. Combined with low humidity and dry vegetation, forecasters say it could fuel explosive fire growth. A new round of powerful, dry Santa Ana winds are sweeping into the region too and threaten to erase the recent progress made by firefighters. A new fire now called the Auto Fire broke out late last night in Ventura County, northwest of LA. And so far we know that the flames overall have killed at least 24 people and displaced over 100,000. An estimated 12,000 structures have been destroyed or damaged. The wildfires are considered the most destructive in California's history, and we'll bring you much more on those fires in California throughout the day here on CBC. You can go to our website, cbc.ca, or listen to our updates on radio, and of course, much more tonight on CBC News at 6 and on the National as well. And on the topic that we had in our last half hour on how to deal with the threat of tariffs from Donald Trump. We have an email here from Linda in Parksville. I agree with a previous caller that the premiers are presenting an embarrassing response by going down to meet with a man who is not yet president. Leave it alone for now and use the time to develop a cohesive policy. Linda, thank you very much. BC Today at cbc.ca. Well, CBC's new series, Welcome to Canada, looks at immigration through the eyes of people who have experienced it. It involves an online survey conducted by Polaris Strategic Insights of 1,507 people who have been in Canada for 10 years or less. Now, you can find the full methodology at cbcnews.ca/welcome to Canada. Some of the findings, 81% are satisfied with life in Canada, and the main reason to come was for a better quality of life, better work, and economic opportunities. And newcomers surveyed believe immigrants are good for Canada, but 82% believe, quote, Canada has accepted too many immigrants and international students with no planning for adequate housing, infrastructure, or having sufficient job opportunities. We'd like to hear from you. What is your own experience as a new immigrant to Canada? I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And if you want to email us, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. And my guest is Neelam Sahota, CEO of Diversity Community Resources Society in Surrey. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you work with newly arrived immigrants at Diversity. What do you see as their experience?
Well, I think it really depends. We tend to paint newcomers as a monolith, and really each of them come with a very different background, as far as different as you and I. And so I think it's a loaded question when we think about sort of what do we see? I think we see a whole myriad of individuals, those that are certainly I think I would say look at it from a standpoint of intent of being here. Some come with intent to be here. Some come through forced displacement, and others are coming in to sort of test the waters. And I think we see the full gamut of individuals, and it's I think each of them have their own particular sets of realities and expectations that sometimes get met and oftentimes don't.
That's a very good point. I myself am an immigrant who came way back as a kid, and I wouldn't think at all that my experiences would be comparable or similar to, any or all other immigrants as well. Given the way that Surrey is growing, what has been the impact of immigration on housing and jobs for people who are arriving? What are they seeing as they arrive and try to settle and establish themselves?
I mean, I think if I can encapsulate it in one word, I think it's hardship. And I think what we're seeing right now is a real sort of perfect storm of decades of growth for Surrey in particular. And we've seen sort of the highlights out in media, statistics that have been validated and supported that Surrey's growth has been incredibly fast-paced over the past decade. And what we're seeing is now, I think, that perfect storm of quite an imbalance of the infrastructure that Surrey is able to offer up to newcomers versus what the needs are for the community. And I think we've reached a bit of a boiling point in many ways of not having sufficient access to housing, not having sufficient access to healthcare, and quite frankly, even services as well too. And I think that's because we've not had the opportunity for appropriate urban planning for this city. And I see what we're seeing right now is really the results of a catch-up period that needs to be undertaken, that ought to have been undertaken over the last couple of decades.
And immigration and that pressure on infrastructure has been such a big topic of debate. And we've heard already from, through this survey that was conducted by Polera for CBC, and again, people can go online to find the methodology there, but there have been people saying, even as immigrants, there hasn't been enough planning for infrastructure. Did the government, lag behind on that, do you think? And what do you make of plans now to limit immigration to try and catch up?
Those are great questions. I mean, I think we've certainly, as a government in Canada, I think have made a serious miscalculation on sort of what it costs in terms of having immigration as sort of the key solution for Canada's future economic growth and the ability to sustain our economy. And I say this because I think we've had several decades where perhaps the cost of the infrastructure and outlay perhaps was not as huge, but what we've seen over the timelines, certainly over the past couple of decades, has been that there has been quite a generous and perhaps well-placed focus on immigration in terms of wanting to have immigrants come to Canada, but not a serious consideration of how do we ensure that the country is able to sustain individuals coming in, and how do we make sure that as a nation we're living up to our global standards of Canada being a welcoming place, a place of opportunity. And so the infrastructure, the subsequent infrastructure that needed to be outlaid in tandem with these immigration numbers has not simply made its way through. Now, that can be a number of different reasons. Obviously, within government, the ability to be able to execute on a vision or on a program, again, gets bottlenecked. And sometimes the impact on the ground is not what has been intended. So I think that's where organizations, certainly like ours, are very much, a voice from the ground that needs to be made heard to our decision makers and lawmakers, because we do quite often see unintended consequences. And so to that point, the recent decisions on actually looking back at scaling a little bit back on our immigration numbers, I think is an opportunity for the country to do a serious reset on what it means to be able to have a certain quality of life when living in Canada, and the opportunities that we obviously showcase out globally that are available in Canada to make sure that reality, that vision is actually true. So it is a time for deep reflection on what went wrong and how could we improve this into the future, because we still know that as a large and vast country that is underpopulated, there is many opportunities that still are on the landscape to make sure that we're an opportunity country that is focused on wealth creation rather than just wealth redistribution.
My guest is Neelam Sahota, CEO of Diversity Community Resources Society, based in Surrey. And we're asking you, in light of a new series from CBC called Welcome to Canada, it's a series that looks at immigration through the eyes of people who have experienced it, involving an online survey conducted by Polaris Strategic Insights, surveying 1,507 people who have been in Canada for 10 years or less. And again, you can find the full methodology if you want to dig into that at cbcnews.ca/welcome to Canada. And so we're asking you, if you're a new immigrant, what has been your experience? Love to hear your stories. Our numbers are 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone as well, or if you'd like to email bctoday@cbc.ca. And Bob is joining us now from Princeton. Hi, Bob.
Hello.
Hi there. What would you like to say? And do you have an immigrant experience to share?
Well, I've seen a lot of it. And, I watch the news, and the mainstream news doesn't say anything about immigration much. But you go to YouTube and you watch different things, and immigrants are leaving. They can't afford to stay here. It's too expensive. Canadians can't afford Canada. And it's just, it's impossible. There's nowhere to live. You look at Maritimes everywhere. Trudeau screwed up the immigration, and all these. Look at all the tent cities and what's happening. Look at Brampton, Ontario, and everything else, what is happening in Canada and around the world.
So what impact do you think will these new limits, looking at limiting temporary foreign workers and international students, looking at resetting, as we heard from our guests, resetting immigration levels in Canada, what impact do you think that might have?
Well, they've got to do something, because we've got, like I say, look at the tent cities, and people in Canada just regular Canadians can't afford to live anywhere, and the tent cities, housing, the price to get into housing nobody can afford it. They can't afford the rent, and never mind buying a house and raising kids. That's why we need immigration, because Canadians can't afford to have kids. And you know, like wartime, they made small houses for families and war veterans and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they had a place, and you look at the new developments now, these huge houses that nobody can afford except the rich.
Okay. Bob, the housing issue. The housing issue is one that really has been front and center in this discussion over immigration and how it impacts people who, as you said, you know, immigrants are not, can't afford to live here, and various people from all walks of life being shut out of the housing market, or even not being able to afford rent. Thanks so much for the call there from Princeton, Bob. Kay is up next now in Squamish. My apologies for my voice here. Hi, Kay.
Hi. Yeah, I thought I'd just further to what you've been discussing related to housing. I've been experiencing, it's almost like a social experiment for me, inadvertently, because I often house students that come, or athletes that come to train here, and I'm continually getting referrals for and from people that are desperate for housing because they've got a job in Squamish, for instance, and they're now trying to commute to a job that they applied for online, and they're living in the city in remote areas, more Surrey, commuting all the way up to the Sea to Sky to do low-level work that's not going to afford them to pay for gas, etc. So I've got so many examples of this happening, and I'm often left wondering what those people are doing and how.
These are students.
Well, there's all different ways. I sort of have learned that they come in through those avenues, that they're doing part-time study to be here, and then working. And I'm often wondering, how are they affording to be here?
Yeah.
And then they're trying to afford to live here. And so, yeah, it's like an inadvertent social experiment. People ask me all the time, have you got a space for so-and-so because they're working for us? Or I've heard that so-and-so has a job, they're commuting, and just repeated examples of that. Yeah.
It's the story we've heard, as you say, different avenues, but we've heard certainly from about students, about international students as well, Kay. And Squamish, of course, is a place that has been dealing with quite a severe housing crunch. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's really enlightening. Thank you. Oh, did you want to say something more?
Oh, I was just going to say, so then there's the short-term visas and all that. I can see that there's a lot of stuff that they're looking at now. And it is important. There's definitely a need for accommodating short-term visas for temporary workers, but it's also impacting those locally that are trying to find housing and that actually are from here too. So, yeah, you're seeing a lot of people that are local not getting jobs because I think the federal government is subsidizing their wages. So it's tough for a local Canadian to compete.
Okay. Kay, thank you very much. Thanks for the call.
Yeah.
Good to hear from you in Squamish. Let me just run that by my guest, Neelam Sahota. In terms of the wages for temporary foreign workers, we know there are different programs, the Provincial Nominee Program. Are there, what subsidies does the federal government actually provide for those workers?
So again, it really depends on the category of immigration. I think there is generally sort of a misplaced assumption that there's a lot of subsidies available for newcomers, and the actual truth of the matter is it's not. There's very few. They tend to be focused on youth and students, and they tend to not be gated, meaning they're available for Canadians as well. And so I think that's some of the sort of polarization that's happening is based on a lot of assumptions they're actually not true. The amount of benefits actually available for international students and temporary foreign workers is very, very limited. And it is something that the provincial governments are responsible for rather than federal governments. And so there are our immigration in Canada and the benefits associated with it are quite a complicated matrix between what does federal government cover
Right.
and what do provinces cover. And the average Canadian, it doesn't know about it because it is a very sort of specialized area.
You know, it's interesting too that Kay mentioned that we do need immigration when it comes to the labor force, for example. And you hear from groups like the Canadian Federation of Independent Business saying they're concerned about limiting immigration and what that would mean for small businesses. How do you get to the balance?
I think getting to the balance is really around taking stock of exactly matching needs with an appropriate supply side. We really need when we say a reset, the reset doesn't happen for Canada just by limiting immigration. It's about going back into real business management of a country and around really taking a look at how do we make sure that what businesses need, what the economy needs for Canada matches our ability to draw people into Canada. And I know that there is always going to be an element that is based on humanitarian needs, but the vast majority of our immigration is really focused on economics, and it's an economic equation that our government needs to get right. And right now, it's easy enough to scapegoat immigrants for being the problem, when at the end of the day, it's actually our elected our decision makers and our government that really needs to have an appropriate lens that focuses on our economy and around really ensuring that the quality of life for all Canadians, whether they've been here for generations or whether they have been Indigenous to Canada or are newcomers, all have opportunities to be able to thrive.
I'm going to come back to your point about scapegoating before we end this segment. Let me just take a call from Jazz in Vancouver. Hi, Jazz.
Well, thank you so much for taking my call.
Sure. What did you want to share about immigration?
So I just want to share a lot of people are giving their unique perspectives and very respectable perspectives as well. So I just want to talk from a different angle, which is people who are undocumented. So there are an estimated 500,000 undocumented people living in Canada, contributing to an underground workforce, doing manual labor jobs many don't want to do. And majority of them live under the threat of fear of deportation and no health care and no other protections that regular people enjoy, far as not being exploited within the workforce and in their regular lives. Now, with immigration itself, the mandate, this wasn't the mandate about 5 years ago, I believe under Minister Fraser, who was at that time the immigration minister. And that mandate was never really realized. It wasn't even brought to fruition in any type of bill because of how many students and so forth were allowed to come in, and it was sort of got brushed under the table. Now, I personally know of many friends and family members growing up here who have been established here for more than 30 to 40 years, but undocumented, and they contribute regularly to businesses such as construction and many other businesses such as the restaurant businesses. But
what's the roadblock for them, Jazz? Pardon me. What's the roadblock for them?
The roadblock is very simple. I'm just going to talk about a country such as India, because I can't speak for many other countries. If you claim refugee status within Canada, India doesn't want you back because you basically claimed refugee as a person who has been under threat for living in India. And Canada doesn't want you here because you've come undocumented from India. So you get stuck in a position where humanitarian compassionate grounds don't really work. But you may have children here. They go to school. They become a part of the Canadian life. And 30, 40 years pass by, and not only have their parents not realized life in Canada as they once dreamt of, but their kids are also stuck in a position as their parents were basically as their parents they came into Canada. So what I'm trying to say is that imagine a person living with no health care, no driver's license, no bank accounts, no nothing, no ability to travel, being cut off from their family in their motherland, and also being cut off from a real life here within Canada. But they have the skill set. They have no criminal record. They contribute. They pay their taxes in a different type of way than any other person would pay. For example, they may have a small business set up or they may have a different avenue of purchasing goods or so forth to still contribute to the tax system. But they are never given an opportunity to basically be a part of the social fabric in a way where they don't have to be scared for their life while living in Canada.
And so in this reset, what would you like to see then?
What I would like to see is whatever numbers Canada has left over to satisfy their immigration mandate, to see people who are skilled come to Canada. Since we've already done this for 4 or 5 years, why not give this 1 million plus people who are living under the shadows a chance at the Canadian life, who can prove that they've contributed to Canada, who can prove that they've been here for more than 20, 30 years without a criminal background, and reach that mandate and let them see the Canadian dream.
Jess, very good to hear from you. Thank you so much. That's
Thank
Jess,
you so much.
Jess in Vancouver. I have about a minute and a half, but I really want to get back to Neelam Sahota and that question of the scapegoating of immigrants in this whole debate. You know, what impact is that having on people who have themselves been caught up in the debate around immigration levels?
I mean, it's huge. I think it's really going to paint the future of how we come out of this reset. We can use this opportunity to, instead of further dividing ourselves and polarizing, is to actually collectively work with the wisdom that is here in Canada. And we've got an incredible amount of talent that we have in Canada, both, again, domestically, and we've acquired externally. And I think what we need to do is to really all collectively envision in what is possible, what do we need to do in terms of proper policies and proper legislation that needs to be really sort of coming in from Ottawa and from our provincial governments as well too, to collectively work on this problem around infrastructure and programs meeting the needs of everyday Canadians, whether you have been born here or whether you have immigrated here. I think the common denominator is that everybody wants a better life. Everybody wants to have opportunities. They want to make sure that they're taken care of and that their future generations are taken care of. I think that's the common denominator across every Canadian, anybody that's sitting here, whether you're a citizen or you're not.
Neelam, thank you. Such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Neelam Sahota of DIVERSEcity Community Resources.